transcripts within the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which can constitute literature as a broad definition of literature. And literature informs people in a way politicians and political science and law fail to. So without further ado, I call upon the next panel, and it consists of Professor Rupa Vajpayee, who is a former professor at the University of Delhi, Mr. Chandana Chaudhary, who's a wonderful writer, and Professor Marshi Lal, who's the convener of the advisory board of the Satya Academy. And I also invite the moderator, who's Harsh Sethi, from the Seminar magazine, and he is agreed very graciously to moderate this session. And I would take your leave and yield the floor to Mr. Harsh Sethi. Thank you.
Well, we've three very eminent people, and it's always intriguing and a bit intimidating. I'm not a literary figure. I'm not a novelist. And I am not an expert on two of the things which people are going to talk about, which is the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, both foundational epics for many of us, in whichever version we might have read them, or been told them, or remember them. We will, like in the first session, take about 15 odd minutes for each presentation and see how we want to take the ideas of not just revenge and forgiveness, but to take some of the concepts that were discussed in the first session, the idea of healing, the idea of coming to terms, whether at the level of individuals or at the level of larger collectivities. I'm not quite sure where it enters the issue of peacemaking and constructing societies which are a little less prone to violence and to injustice. Because I think one of the unresolved questions which remained at the end of the first session is the idea of forgiveness and the idea of justice. And I think Shiv's throwaway comment on the need for order and the need for coherence, and to come to terms with an idea of punishment which is not just retributive, and to invoke in it some idea of justice, I think is an interesting tension which clearly runs through our epics, because everyone at the end of the epic is a bit traumatized, is a bit broken up. There are no victors, and there are only the defeated who have to pick up pieces, and to see whether what after their ostensibly righteous wars they have left behind is something worth reconstructing on or building on. We don't quite know. And I suspect we'll go by the order in which people are seated. So we will start with Chandrahas and then go to Professor Marshi Lal and end with Professor Vajpayee. Chandrahas.
On the moral spectrum of actions available to any human being, forgiveness is one of the most difficult and demanding, and when it does manifest itself, one of the most surprising. That is because forgiveness requires of the person who forgives a self-gathering and a self-giving, an immense moral exertion and clarity in response to some grave injustice. Although it is seen as a way of ending a cycle of revenge or retribution, forgiveness is in fact literally unjust in its own way, for almost by definition it is not expected of the person who grants it. And were it not given, we would actually seek to sanction or prosecute the agent to whom forgiveness is being granted. Therefore, forgiveness is, if not morally troubling, then certainly morally demanding both of the person who gives it and even of those who witness it. In its surprising leap of faith and redemptive possibility, it may be on the one hand cleansing and cathartic, but at the same time it makes witnesses uneasy about our own resentments and our own clogged search for justice. Like love, forgiveness requires that we make ourselves vulnerable, vulnerable in front of those who may have already violated our dignity or vitiated our trust. And forgiveness, for all its force and moral grandeur, need not always be positive, for just like the wrongs that precede it, forgiveness may also be sometimes extracted by coercion and be given as a consequence of sheer exhaustion in the face of an unrelentingly cruel or pitiless adversary. Last, in some especially complex cases, forgiveness can itself, I think, be a kind of revenge. For all these reasons, forgiveness gives us human beings at their most human, paradoxically at their most vulnerable and their most powerful in the same instant. Although it is completely human not to want to forgive, we are never more aware of our powers as human beings when we do actually do so. And for all these reasons, forgiveness as an emotion, a practice, a journey, a personal or political question is something that interests all the humanities and especially literature, which is what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. That is because literary narration, in presenting concrete examples of revenge and forgiveness, shifts continuously between the descriptive and the analytical in ways that draw us in as readers into the moral frame of the situation being presented in a particularly compelling and immediate way. Further, literature is interested in systems of moral accounting that go beyond merely legalistic notions of justice, in a way that is analogous to the operation of forgiveness itself, which wants something better than merely to even out the moral score. Of course, the simplest way of trying to analyze forgiveness, the operation of forgiveness and revenge in literature, would be to analyze what characters do to each other inside literary texts. And Indian literature is full of such situations, all the way from the wrath of sages who are disturbed and who then distribute curses to people when they're performing penance, to Shakuntala when faced with the perfidy of Dushyant in the Mahabharata, to, in the modern Indian novel, the bandit queen Debi Chaudhurani facing the father-in-law who once expelled her from his home in Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novel of the same name. And of course, we could move on to the problematics of revenge and forgiveness when applied not just to individuals but also to states, such as in the violence of partition. But what to me is more interesting is that revenge and forgiveness in literature need not always be horizontal, especially inside novels. Novels have another kind of often invisible human presence inside them, the narrator, who serves as a mediating presence between the characters and readers and passes moral judgments on one and sometimes both these groups. In a novel, is it possible for narrators to forgive guilty or sinning characters, perhaps when other characters in the novel don't do so? And how can we tell when narrators are forgiving characters, and what does it mean within the field of meanings of the book that this happens? Given that characters are real in the world of the book in a way the narrator is not, and in a different framework, the narrator, as a kind of proxy for the writer, is real in a sense in which the characters are not, what are the ethical and philosophical implications of such acts of forgiveness in novels? Here, as I thought it would be more interesting to discuss concrete examples as a way of taking the discussion forward. So here are two examples of narratorial forgiveness in novels that I find particularly interesting. The first is from the 20th century Russian novelist Vasily Grossman's Everything Flows, which was translated into English only for the first time a few years ago, although Grossman lived and wrote in the 20s and 30s. In Everything Flows, we see somebody who has had to exercise all his powers of forgiveness just to remain a human being. The protagonist of the story is this old man called Ivan Grigorievich, who has just come out, at the beginning of the book, we see that he's just come out of jail after 30 years inside prison for a trivial offense committed against the communist regime. And he was tried and sent in, and he, a bit like Rip Van Winkle, he left Russia, he left the public world, a young man, and returns elderly and having missed out on the experience of an entire generation. His life has been shredded by the state. His mother is now dead. His lover long ago married someone else. He enters a completely new world with no contacts at all. The one person he does know is a cousin of his who, in the time that Ivan has been in prison, is a scientist who has completely cooperated with the state system and is now a very well-known figure in the Soviet administration. And since he does not have a place to stay for the night, Ivan writes to his cousin asking if, until the time he sets himself up in life again, he can come and stay at this man's place for 2 or 3 days. But of course, there's something a bit complicated about a former convict coming to stay at the residence of someone who's so much part of the official setup. In a striking passage, Ivan goes to see his cousin Nikolai. Nikolai offers him a confused welcome, while Nikolai's wife, Maria, worries a bit more about other things, such as questions of hygiene. For instance, if Ivan did use their bath, they'd never be able to get the bath properly clean again, neither with acid nor with lye. That last qualifying phrase about acid and lye might have been left out by a lesser writer, but it brilliantly brings alive Maria Pavlovna's pinched hospitality. And now we find a situation where Ivan, the guest, knows nothing about the reservations of his host. He has just been invited over. But we see in this situation his host, Nikolai, thinking about Maria, his wife's protest about how the bath will not be clean. And we read, Nikolai Andreevich was angry with his wife. All the same petty thoughts, each one of them, had passed through his own mind before she had said so much as a word. This had happened many times before. What he saw in his wife were his own weaknesses, though he did not understand this. He was unable to grasp that it was his own feelings rather than his wife's that made him so very indignant. But then, because of his love for himself, he was also quick to calm down. Forgiving his wife, he forgave himself. In this very complex passage, once we try and unpack it, it seems as if it's actually not just Nikolai judging his wife, but rather it's the two kinds of judgment, and in fact, two kinds of power relations are at work. One, that of Nikolai with respect to his wife, and two, that of the observing narrator with respect to Nikolai. In fact, the narrator is the agent through which Nikolai's judgment of his wife is turned back upon himself, for we are told that Nikolai himself did not understand what he was going through. In a way, Maria, Nikolai, and the narrator occupy concentric moral fields, each one fitting into the other, a bit like Russian dolls. We see that Nikolai forgives his wife, but what might be a morally generous gesture usually whenever the word forgiveness is applied? We see that he forgives his wife, but what might be a morally generous gesture is immediately problematized and made ironical because we see that actually the person Nikolai is forgiving is himself. In a way, we are shown how forgiveness can actually be something as petty as that which it deigns to forgive. It is a kind of consoling self-deception. At the same time, though, the narrator's touch is gentle enough that we are left in some doubt about whether, in laying bare Nikolai's self-deception, the narrator is only condemning him, or rather condemning him and himself forgiving him at the same time with the exculpatory phrase, though he did not understand this. Perhaps recognizing the limitations of human nature, even the narrator condemns and forgives in the same breath. But at any rate, the basic point is established that even when we see incidents of forgiveness in novels, narrators can add or subtract their own vision of forgiveness above what is going on in the field between the characters, and thereby influence the meaning of the entire incident. To come to my final example, an even more interesting example of narratorial forgiveness appears in the Indian novelist Fakir Mohan Senapati's 6 Acres and a Third, a book written in Oriya in 1902. This is a satirical look at Indian village society and its vision of Indian social relations and power relations in the village is delivered through a kind of anti-hero, someone who's a villain called moneylender called Ramchandra Mangraj, who in the course of the book is shown repeatedly conspiring to try and possess the land of all the poor people of the village. And he's relentlessly mean, relentlessly sour, and relentlessly difficult. But what would otherwise be a very stereotypical cry for justice and a cry of anger is made very interesting Senapati because of his method. What the narrator of the book does is continuously praise this character, this villainous character, by continuously finding all sorts of bizarre rationalizations and self-justifications for to show that he really might not be as bad as he seems. And because we see the fantastic nature of some of these rationalizations, we kind of read against the grain of the text and begin, the more that the narrator praises Mangraj, the more we see that he's such a villain. Just as we, following the cues abundantly supplied by the narrator, have turned at some point in the book, we turn completely against Mangraj and realize that he is a man incapable of any kind of generosity. At that time, something strange happens, about 3/4 of the way through the book. Mangaraj's wife, Santani, who till this point has only been a marginal presence in the book, suddenly passes away. We know, we have already seen for all the course of the book that Mangaraj has never treated his wife well, he barely gives her a moment's attention. But suddenly, we come across the scene. Sitting near Santani's body, Mangaraj gazed listlessly at her face. Tears rolled down his cheeks. No one had ever seen Mangaraj shed tears. This was the first time ever that people had seen him cry. They had always believed that he was incapable of love, affection, shame, and decency. They believed that for him money was everything, that day and night he thought about nothing else. Had Mangaraj ever understood the heavenly sweetness and beauty of conjugal love? Had anyone ever heard him utter a word of affection to his wife? Why then should he grieve for her today? Nonetheless, we trust that he was now feeling the pangs of separation. Having observed Mangaraj, we conclude that he was overcome with sorrow as well as repentance. The narrator suddenly drops his satirical view of Mangaraj, and it seems as if he's at some point confounded by the behavior of the own character that he's describing. And in fact, he not only does he begin to take a more compassionate attitude towards Mangaraj, he now proceeds to expand the moral frame of the judgment he's making, or is forced to make at this point. He says, in physical appearance, no two human beings are completely alike. So too does their nature also differ. At times, under the pressure of a strange combination of events, the faculties of the mind come to life. Who could have foreseen that Jagai and Madhai, who were drunkards and lechers, would become great devotees of Lord Krishna? Saul, who was an enemy of the Christians and cruelly persecuted them, was later transformed into Saint Paul. On the contrary, all the merit earned by the great Rishi Vishwamitra, through harsh austerities endured over thousands of years, was destroyed by a single amorous glance by Menaka. Consider carefully these sudden changes in human character, their root cause, and their meaning. The Brahmos teach, condemn the sin, not the sinner. How can we tell whether the emotion that inspires remorse in men was not now awakened in Mangaraj's heart? Here then, 3/4 of the way into the book is the first sign of a break or a fracture in the narrator's hitherto quite sure-handed method. Thus far, although Mangaraj lorded it cruelly over every other character in the story, he himself was always securely enclosed within the satirical frame that the narrator had with such delight set up around him, and could never escape it, just as his victims could never escape him. Finally, even we as readers had come around to believing that there was nothing at all redeeming about this man. And in fact, even with the situation of his wife's death, if the narrator had taken a satirical approach even to this situation and claimed that all that Mangaraj was doing was crying crocodile tears, would have completely believed the narrator. However, the narrator suddenly and surprisingly humanizes Mangaraj by insisting that he feels not just grief, but repentance. In a way, what we see is Mangaraj silently asking forgiveness of the woman who has just departed for good and will never be able to give it to him. To put it another way, the narrator not only complicates our view of Mangaraj, he also admits to his own fallibility as an interpreter of human beings and greatly deepens the moral complexity of the story. We see then that narratorial forgiveness becomes the foundation in these novels for a much more capacious, self-reflexive view of human nature and the very acts of revenge and forgiveness. We might even say, taking a cue from Grossman, that the narrator, in belatedly forgiving Mangaraj, like Nikolai Andreevich in Grossman's book, suddenly both perceives and forgives himself. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Sethi, fellow speakers on the panel. I'll stick with the 15 minutes time that is given to me. And I have titled my paper, Sita's Forgiveness and Chitrangada's Revenge. We all know that in India it's a living mythology and it's enacted, reinterpreted, reinforced all the time. The first Ramayana, comprising of 24,000 verses, is said to have been written by Valmiki in the 5th century BC. And I said said to have been written because this is all the oral inheritance that comes to us. But this epic holds a very significant place in India's traditions. And it has elicited comments from several people over time, and therefore even the subject of forgiveness and revenge has been reflected upon. Even a writer as hypercritical as V.S. Naipaul looks back on his childhood days and the Ramayana, Ram Leelas that he saw with a sense of nostalgia. And R.K. Narayan wrote a Tamil version because he felt that young adults growing up in India did not know their epics, and Mahatma Gandhi died with the name of Ram on his lips. When I came to work on Sita for a book that I co-edited with novelist Namita Gokhale, and we called the book In Search of Sita, Revisiting Mythology, my question was, where is Ram's wife Sita in this popular mythology? And in our own small way, we tried to look at Sita's present relevance. We chose Sita, the heroine of a tale of honor, love, war, because in a way, we were searching for our own selves as modern educated women. We watch the Ramayana every year. Some of us wonder about the less position that is given to Sita, or rather, the position given to Sita as a self-sacrificing, passive, tearful woman who becomes the site of family and national honor. And as modern women, I call myself also a feminist thinker, I don't think I want to accept this image anymore, and there's need to go back, not only to Valmiki's Ramayana, but to another 250 Ramayans that were written and spoken of, because many of them have very forceful images of Sita. So when we came to imagine Sita in our mind's eye, Namita, being a novelist like Chandrahas is, thought of Sita sitting in that garden, bereft, alone, grieving, but very confident of being able to look after herself under Ravan's domain. I, being a sort of feminist, I looked at her in the latter part of the Ramayana as a single mother who was bringing up 2 children abandoned by her husband and her family. So with that background, I want to examine Sita's act of forgiveness in terms of 2 episodes of the Ramayana this morning. The first is the Agni Pariksha, the scene of the war after Ram has won the war against Ravan. And the second episode is when Sita asks to be returned to Mother Earth at the end of the Ramayana. Now, what I wish to emphasize here is that I see Sita linked vitally to Mother Earth in the entire mythological cycle. And hence, Sita's forgiveness of Ram can be seen as Earth's forgiveness of human aberrations in violation of her dignity. And we recall that Sita was found in a furrow by Raja Janak, and he becomes the adoptive father. But the Ramayana gives us no information about Sita's biological mother. And yet the child Sita has the amazing strength of picking up Shiva's bow. The child Sita grows up to be an amazing woman who, despite being under the control of the all-powerful abductor Ravan, is able to withstand and negate any kind of advances. So this is a kind of a strength that is deriving from the earth. And like all wise and strong persons, Sita is very cautious about using her strength, so much so that even her devoted husband, whom tradition calls the Maryada Purush, the honorable man, Ram, is quite unaware of her self-restraint. Now, when we come to the Agni Pariksha, or the test by fire, it is important to remember that it is Sita who asks for this test by fire and not Ram who imposes it upon her. Because at the end of the war episode, when Sita comes out to meet Ram, he says the war was fought in order to defend the honor of a family, the honor of a husband. And that war is now over. And you may now proceed wherever you wish to. If you wish to marry anybody, you're free to do so. And that is when Sita speaks up and says that I will take a test of loyalty and fidelity to you, and please build the fire. So it is her choice. And she, in fact, commands Lakshman to build this fire and to light it. And though Lakshman has a deep belief in the divinity of Sita, even he hesitates about this absolute test of her chastity. Now, at that point, we know, of course, that Sita comes out of this test unscathed. And it seems that Ram and the others accept the verdict, and then the movement to Ayodhya and to Ram's assuming of kingship begins. But I'm going to look into the mind of Sita, just as a novelist like Chandrahas might do. And if we read this sequence as Sita's forgiveness, then embedded in this story is that here is a woman publicly humiliated and publicly put in front of others because of a husband's suspicion. Would she not then think of the husband's suspicion as a part of his personality trait, as a compulsion of his inner nature that may actually manifest itself again? The second episode that I want to talk about on this matter, in fact, this kind of suspicion on the part of Ram and a kind of a distance between man and wife, despite Sita's forgiveness, happens at the end of the epic. And this is when Sita is abandoned by Ram's orders. He's now king. Somebody has told him that his wife may not be chaste. And Ram has given orders that Sita is to be abandoned in the forest, and she is at this point pregnant. And this is a violation of her womanhood, a violation of her body, a violation of her impending motherhood. And again, Sita withholds her strengths, accepts this, and in that forest, unsupported by family structures, she gives birth to her twins, Love and Kush, and awaits the future. Not only that, as a single mother, she brings them up to have the military capabilities for their intellectual prowess, and she knows that they are the progeny and the rightful inheritors of the throne. And finally, once the boys are reclaimed by their father, the King Ram, she then just gives them over and then is expected to just be the woman who has never gone through this terrible humiliation a second time over. Sita at this point realizes that she is once again expected to function within the hierarchical power structures of the kingdom. And that is when she rebels. That is when she calls out to Mother Earth and pleads that she may be returned to Earth's womb. And this is then the parting of the ways of mother and wife, of the husband and wife, mother and children, but also the parting of the ways of Earth and the violation of the earth that is symbolized by human activity. And she is a figure of permanence like the earth, and Ram and the others are figures of mutability. And Sita is embraced by Mother Earth and she disappears. One may look at it as forgiveness, but again, I want to pick up the same idea that sometimes an act of forgiveness is also an act of revenge. Because she disappears, Ram is left bereft, and according to some versions of the epic, for 3,000 years Ram wandered, unable to live, unable to die. He never married again, and when he had to complete religious rituals for which a wife is required, he created a golden statue of Sita and completed his rituals accordingly. So this is the sort of tremulous story, I would say, of forgiveness and revenge. It seems to forgive, but it might even be a form of revenge. And this is a very womanly way of doing such acts. From that, I make a transition to the story of Chitrangada, and here I will not need to tell the story, where the revenge motive is very, very strong. And in terms of feminist theory, again, I'm just briefly alluding to writers such as Eileen Sixu and Judith Butler, who talk about women's ways of doing things. You know, a strong emotion such as revenge can actually be done with immense subtlety and gentleness. In fact, Sixu calls it the realm of the gift, and Judith Butler calls it performativity. So let's look at Chitrangada. And I'm citing Rabindranath Tagore's version in which he puts it in the form of a dance drama. Now, very briefly, we might recall that this is also a story of cross-dressing. Chitrangada is the Manipur princess, but she's the only progeny of her kingly father, and therefore she's brought up to dress like a man, act like a man, train like a man. She's very martial and therefore manly in her appearance. While she's going about her activities, Arjun, the grand warrior, etc., shows up, and she suddenly falls in love with him. She goes up to him and makes a kind of a proposal to him, wants to be friendly with him, and he brushes her aside, thinking that he's a little boy who's come there, and he says, go play, just carry on with your own activities. She is like Sita, hurt and humiliated by this assumption of male power, And she goes to the god of love, Kamdev, and says, turn me into a very, very beautiful woman such that he cannot resist. And Kamdev does that. The moment she becomes this beautiful, seductive woman, it's Arjun who falls deeply in love with her. And this is now the predictable stereotype. And this love relationship, romantic, or what we would say in Sanskrit, lasya, it lasts for about a year. Meanwhile, the other Marshal Chitrangada is absent, the village is in trouble, the marauders are coming, they're looking for their princess. And then Arjun says, what's going on? I'm really bored with this 1 year of now. I'm bored of this languorous life where we do nothing but romanticize. And what is this woman that everybody is looking for? She seems very strong, very able. Where is she? I want to meet her. So Chitrangada goes back to Kamdev and says, turn me back to who I was. And then she appears again, a woman dressed like a man, androgynous, functioning as both male and woman. And she sings to Arjun in Tagore's version a most beautiful lyric. I wish I could sing, but I can't. So I'll just give you the lyric with a little bit of a translation. And she says, Ami Chitrangada, Ami Rajendra Nondini. I'm Chitrangada, the daughter of a king. Nohi Devi, I'm not a goddess. Nohi Shamanno Nari, not an ordinary woman. Puja kore rakhibe urdhe she nohi nohi. If you put me on a pedestal like a goddess, I'm not interested in that. Hala korea, if you push me aside, rakhibe dure, keep me away, I'm not interested in that. If you keep me close to you, jodi parshe rakho mohe, sammati dao jodi kothino brote, if you give me the permission and the capacity to be your comrade and your partner, pabe tobe tumi chinite more, that is when you will recognize me. So this is the exposure of the falsity of masculine feminine stereotypes that Chitrangada then tells Arjun. And Arjun has a single line response, which is dhonno 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 ami, I am blessed. So today is the 9th of March, one day after International Women's Day. I really have nothing more to say. I think this is the comradeship, the companionate relationship that we are looking for when we're talking about forgiveness and revenge, and it's the subtleties that literature or reinterpretations of the epics and mythology bring to us. Thank you.
Thank you and namaskar. I just saw Ashok walk in, so he's supposed to conclude and I, had made some notes which were totally different from what I think we could look at, because I noticed that the first panel focused totally on forgiveness. And I also see some Afghan students, which it is great to be able to meet them. And I was aware of their migratory status when I was working somewhere in the vicinity of Jangpura and Bhogal, and near Nizamuddin. And the women would come out to shop, and the vegetable vendors had started to bring in the kind of stuff that they wanted. And it was very strange, because every afternoon I would take my editorial staff. I was working for an NGO as an editor of several magazines, and I would take them out for something to eat, for ice creams, for this, that, and the other. And we would walk in the market, which I liked, because that market was an assortment of various, vegetable sellers and people spilling out on the road, and the kind of weekly markets that India is known for. So I enjoyed walking through that, and we often ended up meeting these Afghan women who were shopping there, and the new kind of vegetables that they demanded and were supplied with. It was very interesting to watch that transformation. In any case, now I think I will not focus on forgiveness as I had planned to do, but on revenge. Because, I, leafing through the Mahabharata for the umpteenth time, we live with it. We as Indians in India live with Ramayana and with Mahabharata. And I lived with a poet writing in Hindi, and he would constantly refer to these two in his childhood, how he played Ram as a child and what happened, and I remember watching the Ram Leelas and also the narratives of the Mahabharata. So, when you shift focus at the last minute from forgiveness to revenge, then I started to look at what revenge means, and I saw that I that you probably know better than me, and you're probably more closely related to Mahabharata than I am, and but you can you when you go back and look at the Mahabharata, and just so, and so I'm going to give you a version of the Mahabharata as just so. So here it goes. I believe the main theme is actually revenge and not forgiveness, because all of the characters who cluster into the Mahabharata narrative are there, and we believe in the transmigration of soul, we believe in rebirths, we believe in going through several births, and how we hover and wait, and then we cross boundaries of gender, we cross boundaries of social and various other confinements in the Indian way of life or societal formations, to be born where we have to be close to people with whom we have to take revenge. And taking revenge means getting equal. You gave me this last birth, so here it comes. And you giving it to me this birth, so I'll be back next birth to even it out. So it's an ongoing process of give and take and back and forth, and gender, migration, and social and economic up and down. It's a very fluid stature. It's a very fluid state that the Indians mentally live in. We are not fixated. It's not only one birth. It's not only one kind of gender. It's not only one kind of social status. You constantly shift and flow. And in the flow, you are transformed by it, and you contribute to its transformation. And you cluster around people who give and take. Whatever you have to give and take, from last birth onwards, from the birth before that, from the next birth, you lay out a kind of a chess formation. And there you give and take, move and back, and, across. So it's it's difficult to understand in a different kind of mindset where you only have one birth, and you do whatever you need to do. You're made in the image of God, and you do whatever you need to do. We have what is known as 33 crore, 33, what is crore? 100 million. No, whatever it is. So many gods and goddesses. So every kind of face, every kind of assumption of, as many people, I believe in that era, as many, whatever was the count of the population, that was the count of the gods. Because you can worship a tree, you can worship the sky, you can worship the flowing water, you can do anything you like. You can, there's no fixation that you have to know this faceless God, or you have to know this God, or there is. Otherwise, we wouldn't have people like Jesus and Buddha and people who put a kind of a full stop in the flow of narratives of the Indian situation, of the human situation, let's say. Because what you and I do, what common population does is give and take, back and forth, up and down. And we go in a circle. But I was just wondering this morning if the yugas from, Satyug to the present Kali Yuga, if all the population goes with the yuga, or are there new people, or they really migrate to a new yuga and continue their cycle of birth and rebirth, what happens? Kali Yuga mein, are the same people here who were in the last Dwapar with Krishna? Or are they, were the people in Dwapar the same as they were in Treta, or were they earlier in Satyug? How have they come around in these 4 chapters to be the same population here today, of you and I? And the Kali Yuga was really, there's a very detailed description of the Kali Yuga in various narratives. But in the Mahabharata, it is mainly people are back there because of revenge, because they need to even out, they need to give and take whatever has been doled out to them in the earlier birth. So you have people like Chidrangda, or even when she referred to Sita, born of the earth, going back to the earth. And what does it mean? What does it mean for a king to bring home a daughter found in a furrow? What does it mean for a king to participate in a ceremony or a ritual where he would be plowing a field and there would come upon a child or baby girl? And what happens to our present fetish with murdering girls in the abortion process. You know, how we have progressed from various kinds of situations about how we live our lives, how we relate to the families, to the communities. And the Mahabharata is mostly centered around the Kshatriya community. You know, they were the Brahmins and knowledge people, the Kshatriyas for whom the playground, the playfield was the battlefield. The battlefield was the situation where they showed their prowess, where they acted. So action and the battlefield defined the Kshatriyas. So most of the population in Mahabharata is actually Kshatriya, if you look back on what they're doing. And being Kshatriya, or if there are people like Karan who are, ousted because of their so-called low caste, or because of his behavior pattern observed by a rishi that he was not actually low caste. You know, that means even day-to-day situations and behavior patterns actually defined your personality, defined the kind of person you are. Even though you inhabited another bracket, still the way you acted actually showed up in your day-to-day behavior, the way you related to situations, the way you handled situations in your life. So all these characters are, something to ponder on. There are infinite numbers of interpretations. You can keep going back and forth and reinterpreting. There's no need really for me to be saying what I'm saying about the Mahabharata, because all of you probably know more than I do. Then, as I said, the main theme, I think, is revenge, so I had to redo the whole thing. But belief in rebirth is manifest in the Mahabharata. The give and take respects no boundaries, and being or non-being they're carried forward across death, across the boundaries of death. That dying doesn't mean anything. It just means inhabiting another body, just changing clothes, just becoming something else. And our current births, gender, status, powers, or weaknesses are there or once accordingly for our given to us during this birth to perform as we do, to even out the last birth's wrongs or blessings or whatever it was. The 18-day battle is for taking sides and settling scores. That you have to understand. And since most protagonists belong to the Kshatriya caste, battleground is. Revenge or a kind of give and take covers the range of the activities. And the social status, birth status, further demarcates these actions. So when you focus on revenge, how do you define revenge? What is the dictionary meaning of revenge? Any one of you? What do you understand by revenge? When you say, I'll take revenge, what do you mean by that? That you will give back what you got, right? Huh? Tit for tat. Okay. Another, English language is, here's a professor of English, is really loaded with synonyms or similar phrases like tit for tat. You know, what you give, you get. What you get, you give. And therefore, the cycle of life goes on. And as I said, I was confounded by the yuga's cycle, whether you cross that or you break it into a straight line and transmigrate into another yuga, or do you come round and finish with the yuga? What happens? So these are questions maybe I'll go back and look again into. So let's take the concept of revenge. The revenge is giving back. So whole of Mahabharata is only focusing on revenge. What kind of revenge? From birth, last birth, from this birth, from being in the wrong frame, for being in the wrong gender, for being, in a wrong relationship. All kinds of situations. They say that in the Mahabharata, if you can't find anything, it does not exist. Everything in the human situation exists in the Mahabharata. Do you agree with that? How familiar are you with the Mahabharata? I'm sure all of you, being Indians, are very familiar with it, or at least by hearsay, or at least by, just listening to it, or being, retold those stories over and over again, and see that every, what would you call the gist of it, the ringing out of it is contained in the Gita. But the Gita is a very short narrative. It's a very short narrative. But the conversation between Krishna and Arjun, why does it take place? There are two different kinds of characters. Who is Krishna? How is he different from Ram? You know, how does his character include deviousness, includes various twists and turns, which doesn't really become a divine figure, you know, whereas Ram would not contemplate doing anything wrong, and he would look down upon and maybe in a very patronizing way take Shabri's, there's patronage there. There's always walking the straight path. There's always doing the right thing. But what about Krishna? He plots and guides and pulls back, and he's even given a name called Ranchhod Das, which is to run away from the battle. And I asked my husband, why was this strange name given to a man like Krishna? Because he says he really ran when he saw that, and he saw that it was not wise to continue to fight or to stand up in a battlefield. He just abandoned it because it would have killed him. So it's better to abandon a battle in which you cannot win than to get into it and be killed, like Karan would, you know. So like other characters in Mahabharata would. So he would just abandon the war or become a Ranchhod Das and even his, the capital, Dwarka, that he inhabited, ultimately sank into the sea and disappeared. What does, in the larger sense of literary references, what does it mean? If the place you conceptualize, establish, just disappears or just sinks into oblivion. And now I believe in the past 20, 25 years, they've really dug up what was known as Dwarka. I don't know. I don't know if there are any archaeologists here who would justify that it really existed, and it can be dug up, or it really was not only in the minds of Krishna, or a part of the narrative Mahabharata, but it actually existed. That means those are real characters. That means the story really happened. And if it happened, then how far has it moved away through various versions from the original story? And what is the message of the Gita, the small narrative in which he talks to a kind of a semi-paralyzed man who refuses to fight his own relatives or his own brethren. And he has to be urged to, because there is the motivating force in Mahabharata is dharma. Now, this is very difficult to translate because dharma could vary from religion to what your allotted duties are as a man or as a woman or as a father or as a son or as a husband or whatever that is your dharma. Your nari dharma, your patni dharma, your, pati dharma, whatever it is which drives you. So that dharma is a very fluid, very comprehensive, very wide, what would you say, a state of being. So if it is a dharma, then, and that is the battlefield, dharma kshetra, that is what is the battlefield called, that where everybody is urged to perform his duty, to play out his part, to take part in the narrative as a character, and do what is required of him or her. So as Malashri said, it's Rangada, born, again if you look at her previous birth, she took birth to be able to kill, to be able to do this, and Drona, and the various gurus and the various people who become senapatis, or what would you call a senapati? A general in the army. They are really people who go through various variations of their being because of the role they need to play. So when you think of revenge as the motivating force behind Mahabharata, then do you agree that it is what motivates action in real life? That all of you are here, all of us are here to give and take back what we were served last birth or this birth, or what we are being, what you suffer as being a woman, or what you gain as a woman, what subtleties you practice, what gives and takes you do. What is it that really motivates people, that really transforms people, that really relates them one to the other? That how would I find Ramin out of a jungle of, he would come from Iran and he would be here, and how would we relate? I don't know. Ashok and I were in the same class, but we hardly ever exchanged a word. And then, he's writing the introduction to my husband's posthumous collection. How does that happen? I often wonder that how are the dice played? That's how it is in the Mahabharata. The dice are played. How are the dice played in our own lives? What game are we playing? How do we go round and come up face to face with certain people at a certain time in our life? Why am I here today in Ramin's seminar? Who is Ramin? Where did he come from? And when you think of Iran, Iran has been in our consciousness. As I was just talking to some students, and they said they speak Turkish, they speak Persian, largely Persian in Afghanistan. And to us, Afghanistan has been a territory which is uninhabitable, where there's constant war, where there has never been a let up, where people are always on the run, where people just go from place to place to place to place. Is that true? Because they are migratory people. And I want to carry on this conversation with all of you because it's very interesting to meet the Afghanis here. Anyway, what I was doing here is, Harsh is signaling to me. So what I was doing here was just exploring the various dimensions of revenge as they manifest themselves in the narratives of the Mahabharata. Through men, through women, in family relationships, in the relationships in the court, across two armies of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and they being cousins brought up together by the same man, how they become to occupy these confrontational situations, and how they take these positions. And one can understand and sympathize with Arjun, who becomes totally kind of paralyzed when he sees his own elders on the other side of the battlefield. So all these situations are really, maybe as a student of literature, maybe symbolic, of the human situation, of the way we play out our lives, of the way we have no control really. But then there is a question of choice, then how you choose, what you choose to do, despite your previous births, despite your next birth, despite your relationships and the status and the gender and the stature you're born into in this life. So I leave you with those thoughts, and maybe you'll look at the Mahabharata again in a new way. Thank you.
Well, I hope all of you have been appropriately confused. I have,
I was very confused myself.
right.
I had to switch the whole thing from forgiveness to revenge.
In part because, my mind is trained to look from session 1 to session 2 and to see whether there are any sets of continuities that we can explore somewhat. But this is a very different framing of the problem.
Poor guy is really confused.
I am,
Sorry for that.
But I think that between the three, if I can make any order of coherence between Chandrahas's and Malishri's and Rupa's thing, is forgiveness a kind of revenge? And I think is an interesting idea. Am I, in doing so, am I actually placing the person that I'm forgiving in a very peculiar kind of situation? Right? I think you used the word that this kind of exchange between people is not just morally demanding, it is morally ambiguous. Now, yes, one can literally, in literary terms, play out with all of this. I don't think we've explored the idea of revenge in any of the three, particularly. Is the idea of revenge cleansing? It's not just with the idea of retributory justice. It's not just the idea of tit and tat. It's not the idea of you did this to me, whether in this birth or in previous birth, and now, baby, you require to get your just deserts. But it is the idea that I will only be able to redeem myself once, in a certain sense, I've done you in. We get that much more in modern literature, but we also partly get that in my very crude reading of the Mahabharata. I will not tie my hair unless I can wash it in the blood of the person who so humiliated me. Why? I mean, is it, if one wants to play with not multiple births, then one is saying that there is a certain social order which has been sought to be degraded, someone has not played by the rules, and therefore someone now requires to be put in place. You could take, multiple birth ideas and to say that the idea of a force like Draupadi is only inserted because an immoral and an unjust society actually needs to be destroyed. So she becomes the agency for destruction. And there are all kinds of interpretations. Now, for more prosaic minds like mine, who are not quite that familiar with either mythology, and unfortunately a product of the modern world, I have been so schooled, I don't quite understand the idea of living multiple births. And I'm interested then in the idea that in societies like ours, what are the kind of resources that we draw upon, which come to us through our folk tales or through our mythology or through the storytelling, to whatever, which can help us construct norms by which we can negotiate this particular world. Is it any different from anywhere else, or are we all the same? And I think that's where the power of literature comes in. The second power of literature which comes in is to complicate the game. And I think a number of people, both in the previous session and this session, did make points about the fact that law, treaties, institutions can only handle a certain order of ambiguity. What literature does is to bring out, and good literature brings out that much better, the entire complexity of the human condition. The fact that things will remain permanently unresolved in certain ways. And therefore, to look for a resolution is to do violence both to yourself and to the other. So how do societies which require order, which require an order of coherence, live with the idea of constant tension? What are the kind of limits to the tension that we, both as individuals in our own selves and as collectivities, that we either construct for ourselves or that we were born into? How do we define that? And I think in the idea of someone transgressing, the idea of forgiveness and revenge, I think, is also intrinsically linked to the idea of transgression of some variety. Somebody is not quite played ball. You're not, that's not cricket. And therefore we need, all right, to somehow put things back. Even when we understand that the notion of what is cricket or what is the dhamkshetra changes over a period of time. What was earlier considered proper may not be considered proper now, etc., etc., etc. Yet at any given point of time, because we live in the here and now, we need to construct for ourselves some acceptable consensus, some acceptable understanding under which we can live, all right? And I think the creative artist, the novelist, keeps on reminding us of the frailty of the consensus that we construct for ourselves, and not to impute to it the order of permanence that somehow the words of law or the words of treaties or the words of constitution seem to impose on them. I mean, that's one way within which I've tried to think. I've spoken as usual a bit more, but I think, do we have 5-7 minutes for questions? Good. So I'm sure lots of people are both intrigued and excited, and I'm sure turn questions. Don't ask me any questions. Huh?
I have a question, if you permit. I open the questions. Thank you to the three of you, and four of you actually, because Harsh also said very interesting points, commenting. I think that, yes, I think that when, putting the first panel and second panel together, I think what is interesting and we miss to talk about when we're talking about revenge and forgiveness is that revenge and forgiveness, they are both forms of suffering. I introduce a third concept, which is the concept of suffering. Because when we take revenge, we suffer, we make others suffer. And when we want to also forgive, we suffer because forgiving is very difficult, actually. And you suffer, and we saw it with the South African experience, but we had it also in Chile, Argentina, Rwanda, everywhere. I mean, if and also with the Jews. I mean, stories of the Jews is so difficult to. So that's one point. Now, going back to the idea of suffering, I want to relate that as a question, but to what the few of you said, and take it first with Vasily Grossman, and is how you recognize the suffering of the other. Now, Vasily Grossman, in his masterpiece, there is a scene where they're making a line, actually, and there is one person who actually feels the suffering of the other person standing in front of her from the back of the neck, not from the face, but from the back. Because you know that in Levinasian ethics, actually, it's the face which actually brings out the suffering, and the eyes and the face. But this, you don't see the face, it's from the back. Stalinism actually appears from the back, the suffering of the back of the neck of the person. So that's one point which was interesting for me. The second point is if we compare Iliad of Homer with Mahabharata, with Mahabharata. Why? Because not only the Greeks never abandoned the arena of war, they fought until the end and they died, but when they kill each other, they respect their deaths. For example, Achilles giving back Hector to his tribe, to his father. So there is this concept of participating in the suffering of a father who has lost a son, and this is what we call empathy. I mean, the Germans call it Einfühlung, empathy. How you comprehend the suffering of the other, I think, which is important. So I wanted to ask you about this idea of suffering, which is behind this, literature that we have, the world literature, not only Indian or Asian. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Nicholas. I'm a professor of international relations at Jindal as well. The question I wanted to ask was about the relationship between forgiveness and knowledge, and it was most brought about in the first presentation, but I'm interested to hear what anybody would have to say. Very interesting how narrators can show us, how to engage in an act of forgiveness, but narrators, by definition, have very large amounts of knowledge about what they're describing. We say omniscient narrators, right? Does having a great deal of knowledge always facilitate the act of forgiveness? Is it a prerequisite for it, or is the relationship more complex?
Chandras, would you like to start? Yes, I can maybe quickly answer both of those. That I think is an interesting thought, that revenge and forgiveness are both involve some kinds of suffering. But I wonder if we should just stop there, ask whether those are different kinds of suffering and whether one kind of suffering is more valuable than another. I mean, we are asked to then perform. Perhaps this is a situation where we all reflect on our own experience about situations where we've at some point chosen the path of revenge and at other points of the path of forgiveness. And surely there's a difference then we feel of the different kinds of suffering involved. And it also seems to me that it also, therefore, the suffering of revenge and even the justification of the pleasure of revenge seem to be like a more morally, we can agree that they're perhaps more morally primitive kinds of feelings. And we are asked in society to try and reflect upon these and improve them. And my final thought was that so we are also asked when we inflict revenge, it is a kind of suffering that also opens the doors to further acts, similar acts. And so one can revenge acts of revenge, or one can perform revenge for acts of revenge, but one can't forgive acts of forgiveness. So in a way, you are closing a kind of cycle in one. Yes. So I would still say morally they're two very different spaces, although they may be bound by certain common words. With respect to your question, I think that's a good thought. You know, in a way, this brings to us a distinction that's also very powerfully made in Adam Smith, the theory of moral sentiments. What is the difference between knowing something and acting upon something? So it could be that in a way, narrators of novels have it a bit easier than characters in that they're not asked to act in time. They reflect upon something, situation, time at their own leisure in a way. One never imagines the narrator of a book is writing a novel, sitting one night and writing it all out. The narrator occupies a timeless space, but the characters are always asked to react to each other, sometimes immediately to each other's face, or as Ramin said, even to each other's necks. So that is a difference in moral understanding between narrators and characters. Then ask upon us that as readers to try and think about some space between these two positions, where we might bring to our own understanding of revenge and forgiveness something of the wisdom that narrators bring, while also something of the immediacy that characters bring.
To add to that briefly, the idea of suffering is, I think, a very important intervention. But when we are looking at the epics, there is this thing about righteous action, because the arena is not sort of personal revenge and personal forgiveness, but it's the larger good of society, for which revenge and forgiveness are necessary actions, but suffering also accompanies it. So if you're looking at the Gita, then it is beyond forgiveness and suffering. It's righteous action. If you're looking at Ram abandoning Sita in the forest, I read it one way, but I have a very well-known friend who's a Ramayana scholar who says there's a justification of Ram, that he is thinking of the larger good, which is public peace. And as a king, he has to abandon his wife. So this notion of the larger good, I think, complicates the matter of revenge and forgiveness.
Well, you will get a mic, I'm sure.
Thank you. I have a question for Chandrahas Chaudhary. You mentioned the character in the Oriya novel who essentially expresses or feels both sorrow and repentance. But what does he do afterwards? Does he change his behavior? Because that's probably the critical ingredient. If there is just gratuitous feeling sorry for oneself and there is no change in behavior, then obviously there can be no comfort taken from that.
Actually, very quickly to answer, the way the plot of the book proceeds is that by this point in the novel, it's almost already over. And what happens now is there's a kind of revenge delivered by the narrator upon the character, in that this man then proceeds to lose all his wealth, and he destroys himself in the search of this one small piece of land that he wants to add to his large landholdings. And so the narrative arc of the book itself is a more conventional one, and it's only at these spaces, at certain points in the book, that you suddenly see these possibilities emerge.
Okay, one is the idea of a cosmic retribution, that, because the guy played dirty all his life, he, in the end of it, gets his just desserts. But I think the other thing, for those who may not have read the book and may never read the book, is to open out the possibility that we look at people in certain ways, but are they actually capable of something quite different from what we've imagined them to be? And once we open out that possibility, do we open out that possibility only for individuals? Do we open out that possibility of the manner within which we construct collective stereotypes? Do we open out that possibility when we talk about what we call nations? Once you open up that possibility, then life gets particularly tricky, because the ability to come to quick judgments, and life is not like writing a novel where one can reflect endlessly and refine. One has to take decisions. Often decisions are in the here and now. Repenting one's decision, may be available for a lifetime, but the choice for making decisions often are somewhat more hurried. And I think that when we look not just at revenge, forgiveness, suffering, I also wanted to talk about the redemptive possibility of recovering yourself through acts of violence, both individual violence and collective violence, which is there both in epic literature, and it is very much there in anti-colonial literature. I mean, Fanon glorifies violence in a certain way, having played out some of my early life as a wanting to be Maoist. The Maoist literature does that. The Pol Potian literature talks about the creative power of destruction. Now, we may couch it in whatever notion of a larger good. And to say that there was no ideological underpinning to it, or moral, may not be true. All I'm saying is that human beings get moved by rather funny things. And they do get moved, and they do act, and those acts have implications. All we hope like hell is that we've learned a little bit from that. And maybe in the institutions or the norms that we construct for ourselves, we will be somewhat less capricious about these things. I mean, that's the best that I can say. We have maybe another 2 minutes if anybody has anything to say.
Okay, thank you very much for your reflections. And I was just grappling with the idea of literature and how it has this propensity to be brave enough to admit that there isn't a solution, which sort of makes sure that the society works in a linear progression of sorts, right? And there is always going to be mistakes, and we might always come back and revisit the same sort of problems that were visited in the past, and we will probably make the same mistakes. So two things I wanted the panel to reflect upon was, one is the idea of the fact that human beings in themselves are comparatively fluid, right? So they are vessels that can be occupied by various emotions and various feelings, like Chandrahas was saying in his recounting of the man who has been horrible throughout, but then in the death of his wife shows human emotion and grief and wants to try and be forgiven. So does this propensity to be fluid, just like literature is, if we put them on the same pedestal, give human beings an easier, so does that make it easier to forgive a human being for something they did, because of the fact that in the past they might have been a completely different, a vessel that was filled with a completely different substance, and now they might be filled with a completely different substance? And the second question is about the possibility of so the tolerance within Hinduism, and this is more directed to Ms. Vajpayee, the tolerance within Hindu religion and the fluidity within Hindu religion, as in you try to think of, people try to portray Hindu religion as something which is not concrete, right? There is a lot of fluidity, and so did India have in the beginning a lot of fluidity, which was then sort of proscribed by the British rule in a lot of legal codification of the customs, which were initially fluid. But also there is these contradictions within the Hindu traditions, right? So the Gita that we were talking about, in my crude and understanding of it and the limited knowledge of it, it talks about how we can worship a lot of things like rain and trees, etc., but then Shiva in his narration says, if you worship anybody above me, then you shall be destroyed. So how does Hinduism or the people who study Hinduism reconcile these conflicts, and what emerges out of them? Just those two things. Thank you.
You're asking for a treatise.
Yeah.
Or, do you want to respond to it?
First of all, I would say that Hindu ism. The word Hindu comes at a very later date. In itself, it's not a religion. It is not a codified religion. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do this. There's no such thing. You interpret it as you like. I realized this as a growing student, that when I talked to the next door neighbors and the kind of, they were putting gods to sleep and waking them up, and I said, what is this happening? So she said, hamare yahan to aisa hi hota hai. This is how we do it. So every household says that this is how we do it. So even if they belong to the same caste, even if they are stratified in a certain order by society, by the social order, they continue to practice individual ways of connecting to the higher self, which is maybe because of the British rule, the colonial mindset, because that forced people to go into their own individual backyards, because rather than to come forward and to relate to each other, they just turned introverted. It kind of introverted the concept of religion and relationships. So maybe it is because of that, because Hinduism as such is no religion, Hindu as such is no term, but they have come to be imposed upon and pasted upon through practice and through the way we handle, because we need this terminology and these terms and these frames to be able to make any sense of the knowledge we have. So somebody here said the more knowledge we have, the more confused we get. That's true, because there is no end to where you can go, how you can go. I remember my husband used to say that when you start to write a poem, it's like entering a kind of a cave, and then the walls close in on you, and there's no going back, because there's no moving. You can just see the end of the tunnel. There's a bit of light, and you just keep moving towards that, because you need the light and you need to get out of there. But there's no turning back, there's no turning right, there's no turning left, there's no lying down, there's no nothing. You just have to move into that circular tube. So, it is like that with knowledge. It is like that when we start thinking. It is like that when Arjun confronts, the inaction that he does. There's no other way of looking at it. This is the way it is. So then you need the intervention of a Krishna or some higher voice you can listen to and which can guide you. But not all of us have the privilege or the prerogative of that voice. So, you manage as you can, you move with what you have and deal with it as you can.
We've overstayed our welcome by 5 minutes. It's not for me to say. I mean, I would like to thank all the panelists. I think they all made very fascinating points, the few that I understood. I hope that those of you listening to these things have some questions which you will grapple with in your own ways, and that then would be the fun. But let me thank both the organizers and the panelists.
Thank you for conducting it so well.
There we are.
Thank you.
If I may make just one last couple of sentences before we finish, it seems to me that we have a broad binary of revenge and forgiveness, and one of the works of literature is to complicate binaries.
Yeah.
It would be perhaps more interesting if we broke each of these concepts into two again and thought about both revenge and forgiveness when both of them are not concepts in isolation. Whenever we say revenge or forgiveness, we think of at least two people involved or two parties involved. So both revenge and forgiveness, when with or without the presence of remorse or repentance on the other side. What does it mean to forgive someone who is not sorry for what he has done? What does it mean to forgive someone who does? At the same time, what does it mean to revenge oneself on someone who shows no remorse? And what if somebody was remorseful, but you still wanted to commit some kind of act of revenge? I think that makes it a more interesting moral feel. That's all. Thank you so much.
I would like to thank the panelists and the moderator for the session. I would like Professor John Biglu to distribute a few mementos.
You can